said Perturabo. That anyone could make such a guarantee staggered Gog. He caught Forrick's eyes as he glanced up, held the first captain's cold gaze for a moment, and then looked down again. If they suspect the possibility of an attack, they will be prepared, said Forrix, extending an armor hand to the table's surface to flick between details of the ships. Berossus shook his head at Forrix, his lip curling. If it is Sigismund who commands them, he will not sit patiently in his cage. He will make attempts to break through the storms that will make them less prepared and more vulnerable. Perturabo turned his head slowly to stare at Berossus. The commander of the second Grand Company seemed to shrink in spite of the size of his reinforced armor.
Sigismund has command,
growled Perturabo, his voice heavy with disgust.
My brother will not have trusted this fleet to another.
Berossus straightened, eagerness clear in his face. Lord, with an equal number of ships I will break them. With the first attack I will...
No.
The word hung in the air. Perturabo stepped forwards until he saw down on the glowing lines of data frozen on the surface of the holotable. Golg could see the cold blue glittering in the Primarch's eyes, the starlight on a blade's edge.
No. They must not simply be broken. They must be ground to nothing. Dorn does not deign to come himself, as his favored pimp would bleed for him. All of the ships currently under your command will go.
He looked up, his gaze moving between them as he spoke.
And I will command the attack myself.
The day, the Battle of Fal. The Fal system. I was with Kallio Lezek when it began. The old astropath had been teetering on the edge of death ever since the psychic onslaught had washed through the Fal system. Barely conscious, he could do little more than mutter a few words of greeting. Each day that I visited him he was weaker, a step closer to death and further away from life. He often slept, his alkalites wiping mucus from his lips as he twitched in the grip of dreams. I am not sure why I visited. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe because he was the only person on the Tribune who did not look to me for purpose and strength. On that day Lezek had not woken, and I had been about to go when his hand gripped my arm. I looked at him. His mouth was moving, cracked lips trying to form words. I leant forwards, dipping my ear close to the old astropath's mouth. His lips moved, but I could hear nothing. I leant closer. Lezek took a breath that rocked his entire body, but when he spoke it was in a whisper that I only heard.
They are coming.
He went still and collapsed back into his pellet. I straightened. I knew what it meant. The bow wave of ships approaching through the warp presses on the minds of psychers. They can feel a large ship or fleet draw close, like lightning rods sparking before a storm breaks. A dead ice feeling had numbed my body. My thoughts felt sluggish as I turned to the door. I had taken no more than one step when the sirens began to call.
Enemy ship sighted.
She's a good ship, thought Pertinax. Only 3 decades had passed since Hammer of Terra burnished hull had slipped the docks of Mars. Some amongst the Legion said that these Martians' craft had a more aggressive temperament than those of Inuit, as if their character mirrored the more impatient age in which they were born. Pertinax never thought of his ship in such terms. To him, she was as she was, and he knew every quirk and strength. The bridge below him moved with order and precision. Servitors whispered to cogitators in clicking whispers. Human officers exchanged spoken orders, data slates and spools of parchment. Tech priests crouched in their bronze niches, silent until machine heartbeat of the ship required their attention. The bridge was the mind of the warship, and the vessel it controlled was a battle barge. 8 kilometers long, crewed by thousands of serfs and servitors, its weapons could pound civilizations to dust. She carried 300 Imperial fists, a might almost equal to that of her guns. Hammer of Terra was her given name, and like all of her kind, she had a single purpose: to dominate war amongst the stars. A warship was made as much of flesh and discipline as it was of metal. That truth pleased Pertinax. It was an appreciation he knew he shared with Fleetmaster Pollux. Though a few amongst the senior captains and battle group commanders might chafe at Pollux's orders, Pertinax could not fault the Fleetmaster. The fleet was vulnerable, and an attack was likely. In such a position, one needed to create a solid defense and conserve fighting strength. Pollux's deployment addressed all of these needs with direct elegance. Pertinax had even favored the younger Fleetmaster with a nod of approval when he had seen the plans. The Retribution fleet formed a sphere close to the ocean world of Fal II. Each commander in the fleet led a battle group of smaller vessels. Every battle group moved on a precise route course. Together, the whole resembled a cage spun from their tails of comets. The Hammer of Terra and its battle group of 12 lighter ships were on the outer surface of the sphere formation, close to the system's edge. Close to the Hammer of Terra, the black sheet of stars bulged. Lilac and green light spread across the swelling distortion as cracks spread across the void. On the bridge of the Hammer of Terra, officers began to call alerts. A second later, alarms sounded from multiple areas. Pertinax took into the flow of information rolling across the augmented eyes and weighed the possibilities. Something was punching into reality from the warp. It could be an enemy, a friend, or something unknown. Until they knew which it was, all would receive the same greeting. He nodded once to himself and gave the order the ship had been waiting for. "Battle readiness!" The Hammer of Terror shuddered, in sympathy with the words. As he felt the ship wake to full life, Pertinax could almost see the plasma flushing into the exchange ventricles deep in the battle barge's hull. The green glow of hollow screens and red of alert lights filled the bridge as meter-thick shields descended over the viewports. Pertinax knew his ship would be at full readiness in less than 10 seconds. Ready statuses were ready, coming from dozens strike cruisers, destroyers, and frigates in his battle group. He looked towards a picked image of the system edge in time to see the stars fracture. A hole opened in space.
Enemy ship
Light
sighted!
in the center of sickening swirl of color. It widened like a mouth opening to vomit. A vast iron arrowhead stabbed from the opening, dragging a vast crenellated hull behind it as it split the wound wider. It was a battle barge, slabbed hull and dull armored. Weapon batteries lined its side and serrated its spine. Pertinax recognized the emerging ship. Her name was the Contrador. She was a capital ship of the Iron Warriors Legion. For a second his thoughts spun with confusion, his clarity failing at the sight of an old rival and ally. The Contrador fired. Detonations spread across the Hammer of Terra's bow. Its voice shields held, energy coiling across the surface in oily ropes.
We've lost one of our ships.
On the bridge, Pertinac's voice was shaking with rage as he gave the order to return fire. The Hammer of Terra began to bring its own guns to bear. Around the Contrador's space bubbled like boiling tar as ship after ship burst into reality at the same moment. The first 100 Iron Warrior ships fired as one, and the Hammer of Terra became a brief, smeared sun. When I reached the bridge of the Hammer of Terra, was already a spreading globe of gas and glowing debris. The warship's death filled the picked screens, burning in silence above the 100 of servitors and crew that filled the cavernous space. The sight of it made me freeze for a second. My eyes locked on the image. I thought of Pertinax, captain of the Hammer of Terra, a warrior who had already fought in 100 campaigns by the time I became part of the Legion. I remembered his green augmented eyes watching me steadily, and the soft accent of Europa that had never left his voice. I shook my head, and the noise of the bridge washed over me. Officers were shouting at each other as servitors and machines spat out reams of data. Raln was at my side, already calling orders to the serfs. I needed to get hold of the battle before it spun further beyond my grasp. But there was one fact missing. I needed to know. "Who is the enemy?" I asked. Raln half turned to me, the red lenses of his helmet briefly meeting my gaze as he spoke.
"The Iron Warriors,"
he said, and turned back to issue a stream of rapid orders to the bridge officers. For a second I stood still, like a man with a bullet hole through him yet to fall. Then I nodded and snapped my helmet over my head. The hollow projection above spun, showing me battle group and enemy positions, Auspex readings and tactical data in glowing clusters of glowing runes. Screens of data from my helmet display overlaid the projection. Inter-ship communication links to the battle group commanders, the Legion contingent details from each ship. To a space marine not conditioned to process such levels of information, it would have been bewildering. To a normal human, it would have been overwhelming. I took a deep breath, felt the focused calm enforce itself through my body and mind. Training and conditioning blanked out every other instinct. I was the center of the storm, a clear point of will and strength. "Bring us above the plane of attack," I called to Raln. I felt the ship judder. The holographic projection blurred and flickered for a second. I glanced back to the raw data of the battle that floated in front of me. 4 minutes had passed since the Hammer of Terra had died. We had lost 10 ships, 30 were crippled, 46 had suffered severe damage. Ordnance had degraded to 62% across the fleet. We were close to disaster. The Tribune was taking fire. I could read it in the flow of activity on the bridge as if it were the movements of my own body. Shields were down across the Frown batteries. Power had been diverted to bring them back up. Plasma reactors were straining to maintain output.
Inbound enemy bombers. Batteries firing. Dorsal line accelerators approaching optimal fire angle. Turn at 30%. Course correction.
I let out a slow breath and blanked out the details of the Tribune's situation. I was the fleet master. The Tribune was under Raln's hand and was only one part of the battle. I focused on the information in front of me. The holographic projections was a tangle of trajectories and amber engagement markers. The position was clear and chilling. The enemy fleet had penetrated a third of the way into our lines. Their formation resembled a jagged cone. The largest vessels set back from screens of escorts and heavy-hulled strike cruisers. It had punched into our fleet and was moving towards the center of our spherical formation. To my eyes it looked like a fanged worm eating to the core of a ripe fruit. It was methodologically brutal in its ugly efficiency, so typical of the Iron Warriors. The Iron Warriors, our enemies are the Iron Warriors. The thought was like a sliver of ice thrust in my guts, as if that fact had only just registered in my mind. They had scrambled their communications, but I recognized their ships. These were vessels we had fought beside, crewed by warriors I had bled with and called brothers. If the Iron Warriors were with Horus, then how many others might be as well? Could more have turned on the Imperium? Terra might have already fallen. The Imperium might already be none. Our fleet might be the last fragment of loyalty surviving. The possibilities made my head swim, as if my mind was screaming after the dead Imperium, as if vanished into abyss. For a moment I felt the old crack in my strength, the weakness that had nearly made me curl up and accept death on the ice in Inuit. I cannot fail now. I will not fail. My eyes flicked across the projection sphere and showed the battle, green and blue smeared with bright red leaking blood. The contingency plans I had made over the long months surfaced in my mind, aligned with the possibilities of the present. I could see it, a way not only of recovering but fighting back. If we bleed, I thought, so will they. 36 companies of Imperial Fist died in those first moments without seeing their enemy or firing a shot. They died running from assault boats locked in the cockpits of Stormbirds, and on the command decks of ships they died without knowing the hand that killed them. Within seconds of the death of the Hammer of Terra, 12 of its sisters followed, consumed by Nova Shell explosions and torpedo spreads. The Grand Cruiser Sulla fired a single salvo before macroshell fire stripped its shields and its hull became molten slag. The 6 destroyers clustered around it ended in the explosion of its plasma reactor. The Crusader and Legate lasted scant seconds longer. They and their escorts took a trio of vortex warheads and vanished into a hungering dark. 24 Grand Cruisers and battle barges made up the tip of the Iron Warriors' fleet. In close formation around the Contrador, they moved as one. They rammed through the debris of their keels, fire and molten metal smearing their prows. Turbolasers, macro cannons, and plasma annihilators scoured the void around them. Bombers and assault craft swarmed through the void behind the warships, killing crippled craft with thousands of small explosions. Seen from a distance, the opening minutes of the battle would have been a scattering of bright flashes against blackness. Closer in, so that the planets of Fal loomed large, the view would have been of hundreds of gleaming shards, moving in patterns and groups like swarming fireflies. It would still have been impossible to tell the difference between Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists, but after watching for a few minutes patterns would have emerged. The first pattern was an empty sphere spun from the curving paths of golden ships. The second was a tapered wedge that grew longer and thicker as more ships pulled themselves from the warp. Where the two formations met, explosions flared brighter than the distant stars.